Hello, everyone. My name is Jess Flutie, and I am privileged to lead the programming for this incredible collaborative event that you are attending today. We're so grateful for your participation in the Skoll World Forum this year. I also work on a team at the Skoll Foundation that is exploring how we can work towards shifting to a more sustainable and inclusive economic system. And so that makes me extremely excited to introduce this session today, which will explore how we might shift power toward that end. Before we kick off, I need to share a few items. Number one, this session is being recorded and will be released publicly after the event. Number two, please feel free to use the chat to engage with each other and ask questions of the speakers, which we'll get to toward the end of the session. The session is scheduled to end in 60 minutes, so we've got 1 hour to figure out how to redesign our economic system. I think we are up for it. After the session, please take a few seconds to complete the feedback survey in the poll tab. We really do use this information to make our convenings at the Skoll Foundation better, so thank you. Finally, on social media, we are using the hashtag SkollWF, and would love for you to do the same. So before we dive in with our speakers today, we wanted to pose just a couple of questions to our audience in Slido. So if you've never used Slido before, you can take a picture of that QR code or just go to Slido.com in a different browser tab in 515007. And the first question will come up, is power like pie? And what do we mean by that? Is power a finite resource where someone has to give up some of their slice in order for someone else to have a bigger slice? So is power like pie? Here we go. Power is not like pie. We're going to see these results come in live. Please go ahead and go to Slido.com, 515007. Is power like pie? Must I give up my power for you to have more? That's one of the things that we'll be diving into today. Okay. Looks like people think power is not like pie. So that's a good place to start for this discussion. We have one more question for you. Second question is, in the next 20 years, do you believe that the economic system will be more equitable, less equitable, or about the same? So what trajectory are we on? We're going to talk about that today, sort of what moment we are in historically and how, what we're driving towards, what some of those signals are. Lots of different ideas on this one, but we've got some optimists in the room. Looks like the majority thinks that we will work toward a more equitable economic system, which after all of the sessions and amazing people that we've heard from over the last 2 days, I also share that optimism. So we'll dig in today and see if any of our speakers will bolster that or change your mind. But first, I have the great honor of introducing my colleague and my friend, Liz Diebold, who is the Managing Director of Portfolio and Investments for the Skoll Foundation. So thank you, Liz, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jess, and welcome everyone to the session. I'm just going to open up with just a few minutes of sort of setting the context and the frame for what it is that we're talking about today. So first, just a few sort of like scope considerations. We are talking about the United States. And we're assuming, because we were pretty open about the session title and the session description, that everyone showed up here today with the assumption, or at least with the agreement that power needs to shift in order to transition to a more inclusive economy. So again, welcome and thanks for joining. So first and foremost, what do we mean by power? Power broadly could be defined by the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. Here we're talking specifically about economic power, which is not a tightly bound definition or distinction between the two. But by economic power, we mean the ability of countries, businesses, or individuals to improve their standard of living. It increases their freedom to make decisions that benefit themselves alone and reduces the ability of any outside force to reduce their freedom. Why are we linking wealth and power today? there was a study that Princeton University did looking at data over the past 20 years to basically answer the question, does the government in the US represent the people? And the short story is they found that not so much. So they looked at public support for laws and whether or not they were passed. So if 100% of Americans support a law, there's about a 30% chance they found that that law would pass. The flip side, if 0% of the American public supported a law, there was also a 30% chance that that law would pass. So it's almost a negligible fact whether or not the American public had support or not. However, when you control for sort of extreme wealth and the sort of top 10% wealth holders in the US, and you look at their preferences, they wanted a law. If that group wanted a law to pass, it had about a 60% chance of passing. If they did not want it to pass, it had about a 0% chance of passing. So I guess the short story is when the American population and the economic elite or the wealth holders want the same thing, then we can all win together. But when those interests do not align, at least this Princeton study found that ordinary citizens will sort of lose out every time. So it's kind of no wonder that about 2/3 of the American population thinks the system is rigged in favor of certain groups. Okay, so wealth can quite literally buy you power. So what does wealth look like in the US? You see a stream of sort of facts and figures and images scrolling across your screen right now. There's really no right or good way to tell this story because there's just a wealth, for lack of a better term, of data and data points to pull from. So I'll just try to give a few. It will be incomplete, but let's see how it goes. So wealth is quite concentrated in the US and has become even more so over the past 4 centuries. So if you look back in sort of the history of time, there was a lot of concentration leading into the early 1900s, where we were actually at the height where the top 10% of the American population owned over 80% of all wealth. And then through a series of policy changes in the first half of the 20th century, that actually led to a decreased concentration of wealth. But since the 70s, we've been seeing an uptick, and we're actually almost back up to those historical highs of concentration. So you can look at both income and wealth separately. So with income, we see, despite huge productivity gains over that same time period, so focusing in on the last 4 decades, nearly flat average income gains. So if minimum wage had tracked proportional gains linked to productivity, it would be about $24 today. And you see the debate that we're having about raising it to $15. So this led the Rand Corporation to do a study that actually documented what they referred to as a $50 trillion upward redistribution of income since 1975. And that means just $2.5 trillion alone in 2018, from the bottom 90% to the top 10%. But income alone is not really what gains you wealth. It's sort of the old saying of it takes money to make money. So wealth really comes from financial gains. So when you look at who's holding wealth, it's actually even more concentrated than the share of income. For example, 84% of all stocks are owned by the wealthiest 10% of American households. That includes retirement accounts. And the bottom 80% of Americans own just 7% of financial wealth, while the top 10% own about 75%. Now, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that disaggregation matters. So the 90-10, the 99-1% sort of frame and picture, they serve as useful distinctions, but they can mask a lot of the real human experience behind that. So, basically some folks in the country are facing greater barriers to economic power and wealth than others are. Again, a lot of the backdrop that you're seeing here is spelling some of that out, but just some top highlights. Disparity of economic opportunity by race, gender, generation, or age and geography really need to be taken into account. On the gender side, if you look at, the gender pay gap, annual wages compared to white men, white women earn about 75% of what white men do, Black women 63%, Latinas 54%, and Asian women 85%. And actually losing some ground, as I understand it, as a result of the COVID era. If you look at race, and again, there's no right or no right data points to point to, but if you look at median net worth as an example, white families have a median net worth in the U.S. of $188,000. That compares to $24,000 for Black families and $36,000 for Hispanic families. So white families have 5 times the amount of net worth as a median than Hispanic families, and 8 times that of Black families. Generation, age. So wealth actually rises with age for all families, but we still see those substantial wealth gaps existing, those racial wealth gaps existing throughout the life cycle. And also, millennials are tracking behind previous generations. So we're not seeing the same gains in wealth of millennials compared to, say, baby boomers. So millennials are actually holding about half as much wealth at the same age that baby boomers were at that time. And then there's regional and statewide variations and all of that. So just putting some things in perspective, all of that said, the economic system that we are in, the rules will reflect the interest of those with the most power. And those rules can and do change over time. So how do we shift that power? We've got a number of folks here today who are going to share their experience and what makes them sort of optimistic. So let me introduce our wonderful panel. We have Marla Blow, who is our incoming president and COO of the Skoll Foundation. I think we can remove the asterisk of incoming in about 48 hours, but welcome, Marla.
Thank you.
Rodney Foxworth, who is he's wearing 2 hats with us today. So he's the CEO of Common Future, and he's also a steward with Imperative 21. Michael McAfee, the president and CEO of PolicyLink, and Felicia Wong, president and CEO of Roosevelt Institute. So I'd like you, in that same order, so starting with Marla, to just share a few words about what your organization does and how the concept of power shapes your work. Marla, over to you.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the way you set the stage here for a really important conversation. And I'm in a position to describe Skoll only at the very highest level, since I am brand new or soon to be brand new to the organization. But what Skoll does is enable and add fuel for entrepreneurs that are driving creative solutions to the deepest and most entrenched problems around the world, and really helping to put a thumb on the scale in exactly the way that we are talking about here, to help people that are committed and driving important change to be able to do so with more confidence and with more impact based on the support that Skoll Foundation can provide. And that support can take multiple forms, whether that's actual dollars or connections, amplification, awareness building, and partnership. So really excited to be a part of this conversation.
Rodney.
Well, I share Marla's excitement as well, and really appreciate the invitation that was extended both for Common Future and also Imperative 21 in this conversation, which is unfortunately always timely. And Liz, thank you for that amazing articulation of the system that we're living in right now. So as Liz pointed out, I'm here with 2 hats. I'm the CEO of Common Future. Common Future, we're a national nonprofit based in the US that is focused on resourcing extraordinary leaders in communities to fundamentally drive economic change in ways that actually are prioritizing the interests of those who are most marginalized and impacted by economic injustice. Many of you may have had an opportunity to observe a panel consisting of several of the leaders in our network. And then, of course, Imperative 21, which is an outstanding coalition that's really business-led and is focused on ensuring that we're developing a new economic system, one with a purpose that is really to create shared well-being, and is consisting of numerous entities that I think are really familiar to the audience, including B Team, B Lab, Conscious Capitalism, and Global Impact Investing Network, and several others. I know, Liz, you asked a question about like, how does power shape my work? And so I think this is fundamentally what we're all focused on. And I think power is one of those things that is invisible for many, but experienced by everyone. The impacts of power is experienced by everyone. And so for me, just to personalize it a bit as well, historically, I've experienced as an African-American man from West Baltimore, back in my hometown of Baltimore, I witnessed what happens when communities do not have power to actually determine for themselves the direction of their communities. And so it's interesting to be back in my hometown where 64% African American, but I can tell you that the vast majority of the economic power is not held by African Americans. And so this is something that we understand, and we can see this in communities across the country. Obviously, this is a US focused conversation, but because of that discrepancy, that is what shapes my work in terms of ensuring that those that are most impacted by injustice actually have power to self-determine and move forward as they see fit.
Thanks, Rodney. And I think power even falls into the Common Future mission statement. So I feel like it's cheating a little bit, or you're just extremely relevant to this conversation. So thanks for joining. Michael, over to you.
Thank you for having me. PolicyLink is a research and action organization. We're based in Oakland, California. And our job is to bring about a just and fair society. And we define equity, a concept that we helped to found in the United States more than 20 years ago, as a just and fair society, one in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And the notion of power is actually embedded in our name, the policy and the link. The policy signals the way we think change needs to happen and what we think needs to occur societally. That our laws and our regulations, our customs and our institutions need to be remade to be equitable. They've never been designed for this multiracial democracy, and we need to do that work. And the link is a direct signal to folks who have traditionally been left out: Indigenous people, Black and brown folks, poor white folks. That link means that when we walk into a room, we're carrying that voice, wisdom, and experience of folks who have been left behind. And we're using whatever influence we may have at PolicyLink to design a world that serves them. And that's so important right now because you have more than 100 million people in this nation. That's 1 in 3 people who are economically insecure. So the design of this nation is not working, no matter what color your skin, if you're not wealthy. And our job is to correct that.
Thanks, Michael. That concept of economic insecurity is a really powerful one. So thanks for bringing that into the room. Felicia, over to you.
Thanks so much, Liz and Skoll team. I'm really happy to be here. And Liz, I'm very pleased that you spent so much time in your opening talking about wealth. Because when I think about wealth, I think about it as a kind of crystallized history. What is passed down to you is a reflection of really the kind of power that your people had, your family had, and the racialized wealth disparities that you pointed out are really a much deeper reflection of our history and how it has had very, very, very disparate, really power imbalances for the past 400 years. I'm Felicia Wong. I run the Roosevelt Institute, and we believe that it's important that people understand that our economy doesn't have to kind of continually throw off or produce unequal outcomes. That if we thought about our economy differently, and if we made different policy choices as a result, we could actually have a more equitable society, economy, democracy. So that's what we do. Power is central to our work. And if I could, let me just say a minute, just a word about the moment I think we're in. Some people have talked about where we are right now in history as a kind of paradigm shift, which to me means not just a change in presidential administrations, but actually a time in which many, many, many people, both in the United States and internationally, could see the world differently, could see power differently, and see where it resides much more clearly. You know, Senator Warnock said on January 7th of this year, day after his election and the day after the insurrection at the Capitol, he said that we are seeing the waning of an old political order, the dying of an old political order, and I think that's right. And I think that dying order really is, it's about a lot of things, but in part, it's about the dying of a way of thinking about the economy, a neoliberal way of thinking about the economy that didn't account for power at all, because neoliberalism, that we had neoliberalism's biggest blind spot was this idea that we are all incentivized by prices, and that our economy was driven by those kinds of nudges and not by fundamental power relations. I think that is untrue. I think that the data shows that that's untrue. I think our lived reality shows that that's untrue. And I think we are now in a position, for a whole bunch of reasons, including a change in political administrations, to actually properly recenter the role of power in our conversations about policy, about race, and democracy.
Thank you, Felicia. I love that you casually just put in there, you know, that we've had these power imbalances for the past 400 years, which is the entirety of our nation. So again, thanks for bringing that into the room. Michael, I wonder if we could turn to you. You know, Felicia talked about this moment in time, and I know you in Policy Link talk about the nearly 100 million people living at or near the poverty line, those economic insecure. I won't ask you to explain how we got here, but can I ask you to talk through, like, how are the ways that you're trying to peel that back? What is it about the system that needs changing, and how are we going about trying to do so?
Well, you know, I think in many ways, the origin story of an institution or a nation is really important because it sets something in motion. And you know, we don't really want to stop and trouble the question, what did we set in motion? And what would be the natural course of it running through its life course? You founded a nation on stolen land, genocide, and slave labor. And we designed a nation that centered whiteness. It centered white men. And we've never really stopped to say, well, what is the consequence of doing that? And our job now is to not belabor that point, but to own it. Mm. And then to set about transforming ourselves first, the person, and our governing institutions. The reality is, I would say, you know, we all are infected by the reality of this environment that we've grown up in. And this moment, to Felicia's point, it's an awakening, a beautiful awakening for anybody who wants to accept it. For me as a man, there's an opportunity for me to reassess my relationships with women and others that I have not seen. There are opportunities for white America to recognize some of their own blind spots. All of us have a moment, if we want to see differently, to Felicia's point. And that's what we're trying to do at Policy Link. The first thing is, can I see differently? Can I see folks who I've not seen in the equity movement? Can I see their humanity? Can I share space with them? Can I co-create the world that I'm wanting to see with them? So to me, this notion of power starts with the first sentence in our equity manifesto, where it says it begins by joining. And for me, when it says it begins by joining with everyone. Not just Black folks, not just Black men, everyone. And then when I join, the question is, what do I want to create? What does that just and fair society look like? And right now, that's what we're struggling with. And you see it playing out right in front of your eyes. We've centered whiteness so much in this country that we are quite comfortable casually talking about the oppressions of millions of people, especially Black folks, who are going to be disenfranchised to be able to vote. Think about that right now. And think about the rapidity with which it happened since Georgia, since January 7th. More than 20 something states, more than 300 pieces of legislation to restrict the ability of folks to fully participate in this democracy. That's what it looks like when you center whiteness. That's what it looks like when you center structural oppression in a country. And we're not particularly alarmed by it. We'll have conversations about it. But the fierceness to fight back on the opposite side, to counter that, is not there. That structural desire to oppress and design it into the system is what we're trying to combat in the equity movement, so that everyone can participate in the most elegant expression of a democracy, which is the ability to vote. That's just one example. Yeah. And so that's what we're trying to do. Rectify an origin story that was not inclusive, and to design a society that will be inclusive with our democracy and our economy. And we really have to own those points, because if you just start trying to talk about doing an initiative to close the racial wealth gap, but you don't understand the nature and the logic of our democracy, our economy, you will end up doing charity work. And charity work only provides a momentary relief. It does not give us an expectation that our society will be better off.
Appreciate that, Michael. I'm sort of jotting in my own head, like we're all wearing the sort of the clothes of our history, if you will, and we're in desperate need of changing our outfits. Felicia, I want to come back to you and the work that the Roosevelt Institute is doing to, like, how do we change those outfits? Like, what's new? Where are the new clothes even existing? But first, Rodney, I'd love to just pick up on that, on the notion of co-creation that Michael just brought forward. And it seems like that's particularly relevant to not only the work that you're doing with Imperative 21, but also Common Future. Would you be willing to just sort of expand on that and where you're bringing voices from sort of like bottoms up and tops down together in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question, Liz. And I think, well, Michael, you really just, of course, as always, articulated something that must always be repeated and consistently uplifted. And even you may have been even generous about this in the terms of, from the beginning, we were not designed for inclusion. In fact, the system was designed to actually oppress and marginalize and separate. And so, Liz, to your question, when you're thinking about co-creation, one of the things that comes to mind for me, and to link it to both to the work of Common Future and Imperative 21, we've had this, as Michael articulated, this founding story that so many of us have been challenged by, to understand the truth of it, to accept and recognize and repair what was done to Indigenous people, what was done to African Americans, Black folks, and what continues to happen to those communities. And at the same time, we're now at a moment in which we can recognize the vast discrepancies and disparities that are perpetuated by the very system that was designed to oppress these folks and these communities. And yet, many of those communities actually have sort of the recipes for getting us out of this poorly designed system, the system that has been developed to oppress. And so it reminds me of a comment that one of our network leaders, Elaine Rasmussen, pointed out in a prior conversation, was that so much of the things we talk about, solidarity economics, cooperative economics, really have grounding within Indigenous wisdom. And I want to bring that up because we often talk about finding new solutions, identifying innovative opportunities, when in fact, a lot of these lessons have actually been developed and have just been pushed aside by the system, the predominant system.
Mm-hmm.
And so the importance to co-create and empower and share power with communities that actually have developed mechanisms, culture, processes that are actually about mutuality among individuals, but also in terms of our environment. And so, the work at Common Future is really principally about how do we actually invest in a way that is non-extractive, that builds power alongside and with communities that have the answers, that have developed ways of owning assets mutually, that can actually kind of guide and inspire others. And so that's the approach that we take. And I think one of the lessons to consider in this, connecting back to the work of Imperative 21 as well, we're just a little over 50 years away from Milton Friedman's seminal essay on the social responsibility of businesses being purely to profit. And the reason I want to bring that up is because that actually, Liz, sort of correlates to what you shared with us earlier in terms of widening inequality. And so now we have an opportunity to develop something that's different, that is actually not founded in the founding story of this country, but is actually founded in which communities that have been most impacted by injustice are actually the ones that are taking the lead. The other piece of that is, as we understand, is that moving forward, the US is going to be a majority of people of color country. And so what does that look like? We need to begin to position those who have been most impacted, principally because of the fact that we're going to be the majority. And one thing, and it's likely to become a part of the conversation as well, is what we're seeing, what Michael was talking about and speaking into the ways that we've seen legislation to restrict the rights of citizens in terms of voting, in particular folks, Black and Brown. There is going to be, and is already, a pushback to the existence of people of color in this country in gaining power and becoming more predominant in this society. And so that's one thing I would like to add into the conversation as well, is as we're having this conversation about building power, sharing power, we also have to have the conversation about what kind of response comes from that, particularly when we're talking about those who have been most marginalized.
Yeah, well, and I think there's a flip side to that. There's a response from those who have traditionally held the power. And Marla, I feel like I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but you bring such a wealth of perspective and experience to the table, and a lot of that perspective does link to those who have held power or large financial resources and deployed them. So I wonder if you could bring that perspective forward as well. Like, what do you see the sort of corporates and wealth holders stand to lose, and where they want to be a part of the solution as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a really important point, right, that Rodney was just making. And one of the things that I've been discussing recently with a friend of mine who's a professor is that as the country has shifted and as the demographics of the country has shifted, and as Rodney was pointing to, the majority of the country starts to look different, what has accompanied that transition and that awareness building around it is a shift to the right among the entire population of people that see themselves no longer being in the majority. And that was across the political spectrum. It's a really interesting study that showed that shift to the right happened among liberal white people, among conservative white people, among the far right already. All of that entire community moved further to the right. So that tendency toward conservatism, that tendency toward protecting the status quo, that infected and became a dominant trend over the last probably 15 to 20 years as this awareness and the demonstration of this change has really started to come to the fore. And so I think what that points to is exactly what you're alluding to in your question, Liz, which is there feels like there is some resistance, and we're going to have to figure out how to build together, as Michael was talking about. What I think I've seen in the corporate space is a recognition of the fact that this is also an opportunity for building a better fabric of the society, and that the fabric of the society is fraying, and it cannot be a successful company in a failed society, right? And that if we are going to avoid more of the kind of storming of the Capitol and more of people taking to the streets and fighting and making sure that voices are heard, there is going to need to be leadership. And where there are leadership vacuums, corporate sector has realized we have to step in, right? We cannot afford to allow this to kind of undermine the integrity of the country while we still try to run businesses here successfully. So I think where we've started to see the corporate sector step in, it has been informed by that realization that you cannot just take for granted that you will be able to continue to survive as a corporation and be thriving in the country and have these trends perpetuate and continue. So I guess those are two distinct points that I'm making, but I want to bring them together to just demonstrate that all of these trends are having meaningful impact and are driving some change and some realization that we can't just stand back and decide that our goal is to make as much profit as we can, as Rodney was alluding to in the essay, and allow the chips to fall where they may, right? That we actually have a stake in ensuring that there is a functioning society here. And we need to be engaged, right? And be active around that in ways that are probably uncomfortable, right? For organizations that are not accustomed to thinking of themselves as playing this role and taking a position on political issues or social issues, but they can't afford not to, actually. And I think that is motivating the activity that we're seeing right now.
Thanks, Marla. Felicia, I recognize that your work sort of lives within the world of political issues. And so I know you're not afraid to tell us what's on the table or what should be on the table. What are the things that this, specific concrete policies, the folks within the Biden-Harris administration and the ideas that are coming forward there. Just what's on the horizon for policy change?
Right. Well, I'm happy to talk about all of the policy proposals on the horizon and some of what we've already seen from the Biden-Harris administration. But first, I want to point out that this panel itself reflects a kind of paradigm shift in that you have Marla and to some degree Rodney talking about the private sector's role in creating a healthier economy. And then you have me and Michael talking about the role of policy or government in all of that. And then, of course, all of us represent nonprofits. So really, you actually have a moment where the private sector, the public sector, and the nonprofit sector are pushing more or less in the same direction. Of course, you also have the kind of backlash, pull in the other direction, the kind of white lash, actually, that is the reaction to really a shift in power and a shift in status. But I like to think that the people on this panel represent the new and the new way forward. But anyway, that's just context. Let me say a little bit about some of the policies that we see being proposed right now. I want to talk a little about the American Jobs Plan, which is the $2.2 trillion plan that for really restructuring the American economy, creating 15 million jobs that the Biden-Harris administration has put forward over the last week or so. One very important thing about the American Jobs Plan, this represents a kind of scale of government spending that is astounding, right? If you add this to essentially the $6 trillion that has already been spent through the CARES Act and the rescue plan, most of which was part of COVID relief, this is an era of big numbers. We're talking about, $8-9 trillion of money to be spent. That in and of itself is a reflection of a paradigm shift. It says that government spending at scale actually has a role in not just mitigating harm, but actually affirmatively creating more inclusion, better jobs, and more equity. It's not lost on me that the American Jobs Plan explicitly talks about improving racial equity, has money for childcare providers, has money for long-term care providers. Within that set of proposals, this scale is really a reflection of a new way of thinking. Of course, the plan's going to have a lot of, already has had a lot of pushback, but the fact that it's even being proposed in and of itself at this scale is remarkable. The other quick thing I'll say is that the plan also is not just about the scale of money, but about the structure of money. We have to make sure that as money goes out, for example, as money goes out to decarbonize the economy and to make sure that we are able to produce domestically, electric vehicle charging stations and batteries to capture solar and wind energy, renewables, that the control of this money is actually in the control of communities who need it most, frontline communities, communities of color, Rodney, communities in Baltimore, indigenous communities. We have to actually pay attention to how this money is structured and governed in order to create true equity, true democracy, and actually to make sure that the whole thing works. So I'm excited about the structure and the scale. I'm also not naive about the fight that's going to be ahead to see any of these ideas put into reality and then to see them executed in a way that lives up to their promise.
I love it. I feel like the notion of community control over their economic destiny is speaking Rodney's love language. So I'm sure that he has things to add there. But Michael, I want to ask you, because I know Policy Link is not only sort of a driving force behind making sort of equity-centered recommendations and putting those forward. But you're working directly with the administration these days on the execution side of some executive orders. So I wonder if you could just share a bit more about where you're getting your hands into the party.
Yeah, getting our hands in the party and in this administration started a few years ago. When we went through our leadership transition, where I transitioned into the president and CEO role, we asked the fundamental question, do we deserve to exist still? Because I believe our institutions have to get back to wanting to exist because they're willing to do the work that this moment requires that they're in, not just because they have good brand or have had good leadership in the past. And we centered that 100 million living at 200% of poverty. And so when we asked that question, it made us look at our work in very different ways. And one of the things we had to decide was that we were going to set a 20+ year journey in motion to change the nature and the logic of the federal government to start. That if we really wanted to do good work, we could no longer just do the implementation of good programs like we had done in the Obama years with Promise Neighborhoods, Choice Neighborhoods, Sustainable Communities, the Healthy Food Financing Initiative. Those are still important. But to do those things, while you still have a government that is doing immense harm, like dismantling the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, caging and separating children, et cetera, you're never going to get ahead of it. So we had to really shift from accepting charity as a good policy win to saying we need charity plus a government that can be anti-racist and pro-Black. Because if we can get it to be anti-racist and pro-Black, we have a fighting chance to get it to want to help and serve everyone. And lo and behold, we advanced this thing called a racial equity governing agenda. The Biden administration comes along, centers racial equity, and we were in play. We didn't think we would be in play around the things that I'm talking to you about probably for another 5 or 10 years. But the bottom line is now, outside of working with a host of others to help to advance that racial equity executive order, we're now working with McKinsey as an example, to Felicia's point around working across sectors. We're working with McKinsey to design the tool that'll give us insight into our governing institutions to see where are they causing harm and where can they do good and do more of it. We're designing that tool right now. It's a technical opportunity, but if done the right way, it becomes quite transformative to the elected officials and the managers within government to advance racial equity. So we're designing that right now. We're also working with the Urban Institute right now. to come up with a counter to the Congressional Budget Office scoring of federal legislation. We want to create a racial equity scoring. We've had too many misses recently. You know, you can't continue to advance public policy and say, oops, we used the name of low-income people, and yet we missed the mark. PPP misses the mark. Opportunity zones misses the mark. You spend nearly over $4 trillion in a pandemic, and you still have millions of folks facing imminent eviction. How can that be possible? How can that be possible? You could have paid off student loan debt. You could have paid off everybody's ability to be burdened with income, rent that they can't afford because of the pandemic, and you still would have had some trillions left over. This is what I mean by a government that is anti-racist and, quite frankly, hostile to low-income people. I mean, think about it. Think about if you had to really try to go and run the gauntlet of state agencies right now to get your unemployment check in this pandemic, you would see exactly what I'm talking about. And so that is our work right now, to help implement that racial equity executive order through those two areas that I just described, but also beginning to design a new suite of federal incentives that would encourage state and local government and corporations to step into this racial equity moment and begin to do the design work that we've been talking about to bring about equity. So that's where we're playing right now. It's still early days, but what I can tell you is this. The administration has done what I think is all that they can do right now in the most transformative way, which is to acquire the language, center the work. It's going to take civil society and corporate America now wrapping our arms around the federal government and helping them be successful. The environment for racial equity is still hostile, and it's only going to get more hostile. And so we can't project all of our hopes and aspirations into this administration. We've got to help them, and we've got to want to be in this work for the long haul. And so outside of those technical things, helping to craft the right narratives around how do you step into racial equity and not have people feeling like it is excluding them is a big piece of the work that we're working with ad agencies to help us figure out. That's what's going on right now.
Just a little bit of what's going on. No, I appreciate the concreteness there. There's real solutions being put forward, and folks are working hard to make them happen. We're getting some interesting audience questions. I want to bring voice to one. We're super lighthearted. Is power ever really shared without revolution? Any takers?
So I'll wade in and then buy some time for the other panelists to chime in as well. Because it's something that I've actually wondered about, and I've wondered about it in a variety of contexts, whether it is about power sharing or about real true change, or spent my career in consumer finance and looking at leverage. And are there instances where leverage, where individuals have delevered in the absence of a crisis, right? And that do people pay down, right? We've seen debt go up and to the right across our society for the last 50 years. And there's not very many instances anywhere in the world, right, where these kinds of forces of significant change in trajectory really happen absent some kind of crisis, whether it's revolution or economic crisis or significant threat that unfortunately I don't see. And I've asked people who are much more educated and much more aware of the history and world history and world trends. And unfortunately, by going backwards and looking at historical instances, there's not a lot of evidence, right, that there is meaningful shift in kind of current state of play, absent dramatic intervention of some kind. So that said, there are opportunities now for us all to engage differently and engage with one another directly. And I think some of the tools of innovation, some of the tools of communication, technology, and awareness building that are at the disposal of everyone, right, and can be used for good and for evil, as we probably all talked about, social media and otherwise, there may well be a unique opportunity to drive change without the destructive forces that have typically accompanied it. but it would be one of either very few or zero examples that I've gotten anybody to highlight for me so far after having asked this very question. I think it's a fascinating question. But I'll let everybody else chime in now.
Well, I'll take this.
Rodney, I was going to ask you to jump in.
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at it. And so one thing that it comes to mind for me is that whether it's I think those of us in this conversation, those who are participating in this dialogue, are at least not hostile to the idea of sharing power. And as Michael, as Marla, as Felicia has alluded to, I don't think we can expect that others share that opinion and perspective. And so I think part of this, Liz, goes to your question that you posed to the audience around what is power like pie. And I think about, again, being back home, thinking about Freddie Gray murdered in the custody of police 6 years ago, and the many Black men consistently, unfortunately, over the last several years, and thinking about in the state of Maryland, in which the first state to abolish the Bill of Rights for police. And hopefully this becomes a trend. But the reason I bring this up is that there was not just a moment, but several moments that built into momentum of power and influence that set the stage for a shift in how something operates in the state of Maryland as it relates to effectively piercing the veil. It was much more than a veil, actually, in terms of how police can operate in communities in the state. But that required not a sharing of power, it required actually influence and power to be built by individuals and communities that did not have the same level of influence and relevance, certainly 6 years ago, as it does today. And so maybe even thinking about the question a little bit differently about what is it about power sharing? Is it about the opportunity to seize power when there are moments and opportunities to seize it?
Yeah, I'm realizing that as I thought the conversation's running away, we have very little time left. And I really want to get a sense from each of you about like your vision for the future. If you think 20 years from now or a generation from now, what do you think is possible? We've surfaced some pretty thorny and sticky issues in this conversation and in the 400-year history of this country. So looking in the, let's say, relatively near term of a generation, what's possible and how do we get there? Felicia, could I start with you?
Yeah, I think I said this just a few minutes ago, but I am at once very optimistic and frankly very frightened. I'm actually optimistic because we are in the middle of this paradigm shift in thinking about how the economy can and should and does work. Our old paradigm, neoliberalism, doesn't explain anything very well anymore. And so I think there is a huge possibility and actually a kind of coherence around a new idea that basically says that government can and should do good for the public. That government, when structured well, can actually set the stage for a healthier economy and a healthier democracy. And that is in and of itself a kind of ideas revolution. So I'm really optimistic about that. And I'm really frightened about the possibility that our racial divisions and the very racialized white lash that we are seeing right now, that we saw on January 6th, that we are seeing with a good number of elected officials in this country, as well as many people in the American public. This isn't 10%. This is, a plurality of Americans are pushing back against this government can be us, government can serve a multiracial democracy, can be a multiracial democracy. And so that is this thing that's pulling exactly in the other direction. And I think we've just got to push harder and smarter and faster on these toward this healthier democracy, which is possible. A new world is within our imaginative powers. Let's just hope we have the muscle to get there.
Imagination mixed with execution. Rodney, can I ask you the same question, and then I'll go to Marla and then Michael?
Yes, I think I'm going to double down on what Felicia pointed out. I know there was a question by the audience in terms of how do we have, organize around racial unity. And one thing that comes to mind for me consistently in the US, when we talk about the power dynamics, we talk about race and economic injustice, we need to remind ourselves, in fact, that racism profits the status quo, right? The separation, the distinctions, the with everything that Felicia articulated, these are actually means in which we have been, it actually obfuscates sort of the real challenges that we need to be pursuing. And what I mean by that is during the pandemic, we've seen increased accumulation of wealth by the same individuals, the same entities, and that continuous entrenched power dynamic will only continue until we recognize that we're better off binding together, and to Felicia's point, not pushing back against the opportunity for government to make positive change, not pushing back against the opportunities for communities of color to step forward and actually lead with voice and power. These are things that are oftentimes made to be choices, binary choices between, say, low-income white folks and everyone else. Well, that is not the case. This is actually an opportunity for us to be united and actually recognize that we can create a system that does not profit solely the major corporations, that do not profit solely those who are already wealthy in this country.
So we're talking system redesign. So Marla, I feel like you're up with your new role at Skoll. What's possible in the next generation, and how do we get there?
I'll make it quick. My own micro experience just to illustrate, because I think we do overestimate what we can do in short periods of time and underestimate what we can do in long periods of time. And if we're going to take this generation and treat that as a long period of time, I think there is an opportunity for significant change. And I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that I'm actually in Atlanta right now visiting my sister and my mother. And my mother and I talked about my new job and what I'm doing at Skoll. And my mother is only barely able to communicate. But one of the things she has communicate now, but one of the things she's communicated to me in my life is that there is real change in this country, and that I cannot fathom what my grandmother's experience in this country was like, right? And that the notion that my grandmother would be doing and have the opportunity that I have now ahead of me is something that was unthinkable, right? To a woman that, my mother had to walk around the building in her community to drink water out of a hose out of the back of the building, because Black people were not allowed inside of any city buildings in the town where she lived. And there was a hose out back where you could drink. And so the theory that, within 2 generations in this case, that I will be taking on the leadership role that I'm about to take on is indicative of at least some of what's possible. And so I do think it's important for us to hang on to that and use, it's anecdotal, it's limited, it's not enough, but there is demonstration of the possibility of change, and that change can be dramatic in a generation or 2.
Really appreciate that perspective. Michael, what's possible? Share your vision.
Wow, Marla, you triggered me with that. My grandfather was run out of Mississippi because he struck a white man that would not pay his family after picking cotton one day. And that's a death sentence in Mississippi. And here I get to sit talking about a racial equity governing agenda. So when you said that, it sent chills through my body, because we're standing on the shoulders of such hard fought hopes and aspirations. And I do believe we can realize the promise of racial equity in our lifetimes, but it requires that we all do our work and not just see this as something that is external to us. A friend of mine says that the self is an instrument to be played beautifully. And so as we talk about this work, that's what I'm trying to learn to do with myself, and I by no means have it right. But it starts with this notion of power, owning it. If I spent my whole life trying to get to a place to be of service, how tragic for me to sit in the seat and act like I don't have power. I do have power. And I ought to have enough sense to love my brothers and sisters and siblings enough to want to be in relationship with them, to want to design a world that works for all of us. And that's a perpetual struggle. It starts inside PolicyLink, making sure my compensation doesn't lift off from the person that makes the least amount at PolicyLink, co-creating policies and systems that are restorative, hearing staff feedback about where I don't have stuff right and struggling through the messiness of having a diverse staff and harnessing all of that energy. It's a beautiful thing when it works, but man, it is hard to hold on to. And that is the same challenge that is for this nation. It's a beautiful thing when it works, but it is hard to get us there. But we are capable right now. The most educated group in this country is Black women. We've come a long way. So when we think about what we can do right now, we can transform our governing institutions. Rodney and others are, Felicia, they are working to remake our economy. So I am tremendously hopeful. And I know that if I do my work, which is the only thing that I can control, and others do their work, which I see them doing every day, there is no doubt that future generations will have the opportunity to be better off than us. And our environment will be better off than where we are at right now. And so that's what I see. I see leaders growing up, stepping into their power, not being afraid to bring their soul into the work, not able to bring their heart into the work, to love and see the humanity and the dignity of every single person in this country, and then to have the audacity and the courage to set about designing a world that includes them. That's what's possible. Equity.
Oh, wow. You all give me goosebumps. I take the call for the work. It's like we've talked through individual, collective, institutional, systemic work that lies ahead, that is being done now. Count me in, sign me up. I thank you all for sharing your perspective, your ideas, just your humanity with us today, and thank everyone for joining us in the session. Unfortunately, we've got to wrap. I feel like I could talk to you forever and just keep the inspiration going, but thank you all for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.